So you say, I make my whole team 20% more impactful, more productive. So we go from 500 impact points to 600. Well, that's how I get my 100 impact points as a manager.
Hello and welcome to Graduate Theory. My guest today is the founder and COO at his startup, Circular. He has over 10 years of work experience at Google and recently was VP of Engineering and COO at Airtasker. He's also the co-host of his own podcast, the Startup Podcast. Please welcome Yaniv Bernstein.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on today, mate. You've had some really cool experiences through your career and really held some great positions and interacted with some really interesting people. I'd love to kind of wind back the clock a little bit to start with and talk about your early days in your career and particularly like we discussed this just before, but some parallels with today and when you started your career. So at the moment, the markets and things are kind of on a downwards trend, particularly in the last couple of weeks. And that we were saying, that's kind of similar to when you finished university back in the day. I mean, I'd love to talk about your experience kind of looking for jobs at that stage and kind of weighing up your own opportunities, kind of what that was like going through that period back when you finished uni.
Yeah, for sure. So I did my undergraduate computer science degree and I graduated or I finished studying at the end of 2001. Um, and that period was when the initial dot-com bubble had burst around 2000, 2001, what was called the tech wreck or the dot bomb, where the NASDAQ was way off its highs. A whole lot of startups cratered or laid people off. And generally, the economy in software development had really taken a turn for the worse. And one of the things that also happens in those situations is that grad programs tend to be one of the first things to go. Uh, and one thing that was different from today is that there was a lot less information available in terms of early career groups, podcasts like this, and so on. And I think I was your typical clueless university student. I hadn't really thought about how to take my career into my own hands, and so I applied for a few standard grad programs. I don't think I interviewed very well back then either. And so basically, a combination of those factors, I had good grades, but didn't interview that well. And most significantly, grad programs were massively tightened up. I actually didn't get any job offers. Um, and so at the same time, I was made aware, I guess, I hadn't been that thoughtful about it, but that I could do an honors program. And so it felt that with the lack of job opportunities, I may as well do the honors program, which I did. And I found myself enjoying that and enjoying research a lot more than I expected to. And of course, honors only takes 1 year, and the job market hadn't massively improved in that year anyway. And so when that ended, I decided to do a PhD in computer science. And I really enjoyed that. It was actually a nice time in my life. But also, what it did was give me the credentials and uh, allow the market to recover to a point where I was able to go straight from that into a job at Google, which I don't think, for a variety of reasons, would have been open to me outside of my undergrad. So, actually, coming into the workforce or graduating uni when the job market was tough has set my career on the course that it's been on. I suspect if I'd gotten into a graduate program at a managed services company, I wouldn't have had as interesting a career. And so, I'm sort of grateful in a sense for what felt like a bit of a misfortune at the time. And, of course, it's very hard to predict the future, but the markets are incredibly choppy right now. Tech company layoffs are in the news for the first time since 2008 at the latest rather. And so it is worth thinking people might be feeling a little bit nervous and understanding that when you look at things over a longer arc, it's very hard to predict, which setbacks and which opportunities actually end up working out best.
Yeah, definitely. Like what you said there, it's kind of hard to know in the moment, but it's easy to know looking backwards, and it kind of makes sense looking back. Is doing a PhD and things like that something that you would like you said, perhaps it's partially contextual to like the market and the job market, like when you're graduating. But is that something that you would like you would looking back are really glad that you did, and you perhaps do again if you were a young person today?
Yeah, it depends on your motivation. I would suggest that you shouldn't do a PhD in order to get a leg up in the job market unless you have very specific career goals that involve either obviously an academic career or maybe, being highly specialized data scientist, AI type person where having that deeper research credential can really get you ahead. Um, what I found when I did my PhD is that I enjoyed it. And so, if you really enjoy sinking your teeth into a problem, uh, it's actually a quite nice halfway house or transition between university and work as well. Uh, you're
Mm,
much more expected to do things on your own. You're sitting in a lab, which when you're doing computer science, it's basically just an office. Um, and you meet your supervisor once a week, once every 2, 3 weeks, depending who you've got, and the rest is up to you. And so it's a lot like a job, except with less money, but also, less pressure in some ways. People put a lot of pressure on themselves in a PhD, and there's certainly a lot of work to it. But I found it was actually a really enjoyable time of my life, and I made good friends and connections there that a number of whom I'm still in touch with. Uh, but if you want a more general career and you don't think that you'll enjoy doing the PhD for its own sake, then I find people who go in without that sense of enjoyment and curiosity just have a really miserable time, and they don't get the benefit of it.
mm, yeah, no, certainly, I totally see that. I think that's really cool. Let's talk now about so you finished your PhD and you're kind of on the job market looking for things to do. Was that a consideration there, or did you consider kind of continuing down the academic path?
I think I knew I was done then, and I was I think I'd reached certain conclusions. My research was broadly in the area of information retrieval or search. By the time I finished, it was 2006. By then, Google was already a pretty large, pretty significant company that IPO'd in 2004. And what I saw during the course of my research was that the best research was actually being done in those private companies anyway. And the big challenge that the academic sphere faced, and I think this has only gotten worse in a lot of disciplines, is that in order to do good research, you needed access to high quality data. And the high quality data had become proprietary, right? So if you're doing research on search engines and the best algorithms require access to click data and all sorts of stuff, high quality crawls on the web and so on, well, Google had all that stuff and they weren't sharing it. And so in academia,
Mm,
we were forced to do research on somewhat artificial problems. And I just felt it started to become a little bit meaningless. And, I guess it was easy in a way doing research in search engines just when Google was becoming this absolute beast. It seemed like an obvious place to go, and so I didn't
mm.
actually put too much thought into what to do next. It felt like somewhere where I could, in a sense, continue the spirit of some of the work I was doing, but do it at a place where you could have meaningful real world impact. And that's pretty much how it worked out.
Yeah, cool. And when you started at Google, did you start like straight away? Because I know you went overseas and worked in Switzerland for a while.
Mm.
Did you was that something where you were in Australia and you went straight over there?
Yep, it was sort of that fairly typical Aussie thing where we kind of feel like, before you get too many attachments and commitments, it might be fun to live overseas for a few years. And it probably would have been, the obvious thing. And ultimately, if I was making the decision purely on a career basis, I probably should have gone to San Francisco and worked at the headquarters. But, living in Switzerland in the center of Europe, it felt like it would be more fun. So I actually applied directly for the job in Zurich just based on wanting to live in that part of the world. And yeah, I did have the job. Like I'd applied for the job while I was finishing up my thesis, but I took 3 months off and I basically traveled not exactly overland, but we did a long, slow trip from Australia to Switzerland through China and Central Asia and South Asia, which was a lot of fun.
Mm. Yeah, that's so good. And it's yeah, good place to work to be able to travel around and almost do
Mm,
that classic sort of Australian European experience,
yeah.
but you're there for a bit longer and you get to see a bit more stuff. Um, so lots of people highlight like their international experiences when they come back and they're able to kind of look at problems in new and unique ways. Was that the case? Do you think for yourself as well? Do you feel like being overseas and internationally gave you that a bit more breadth when looking at like different problems that you've faced in your career?
I think there's two things, or maybe two and a half things. So, one is the international experience itself, where you just get to see how people live somewhere else, right? And it helps you triangulate a bit, right? When you've got two data points, this is how we do things in Australia, this is how they do things in Switzerland, it challenges some of your assumptions that there's only one way of doing something. And that's certainly valuable. Um, the other thing, and this is sort of the and a half, is that in the workplace you get exposed to a lot of different cultures and different ways of thinking. Now, I only count that as a half because quite often, you get very international workforces in Australia. But certainly, I got to spend a lot of time working with various people from European cultures and learning how to interact with folks like that. Certainly, it's another kind of string to your bow. Um, but the other thing, and this was less about working overseas as such and more about working at a company like Google, is that there is still a lot of, especially, I'm in technology, obviously. There are a lot of best practices, the sort of most progressive ways of doing things, building tech software products that are not fully developed in Australia. And so working at a company that really does things to that standard um, was really valuable. And if I may briefly plug my podcast, the Startup Podcast,
Mm,
that's really our kind of byline there is to say, we're about how to build a startup that is Silicon Valley style, right? Which is how do you work in a way that places like Google and Facebook and Airbnb and whatnot really did things. And even though I was never actually in Silicon Valley, having worked for Google, whether it was in the US or Switzerland or even in Australia, I think really gave me a perspective that I wouldn't have gotten if I'd worked for an Australian based company.
mm. Yeah, that's a really good answer. Yeah, I think that's super cool. And because I think sometimes it's hard, whether you're an organization or even as a young person or even as any person in your career, sometimes it's hard to know kind of, what does a good version of this look like? And sometimes you can kind of just be, you know, trying stuff out and seeing what works well, but you can really like take whole new leaps forward by understanding, okay, this is the kind of bleeding edge way of doing things. And like, yeah, I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean that's right. Like they talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, right? If you want to be really good at your craft, it's incredibly valuable to be exposed to people who are doing it, the best in the world. Trying to bootstrap yourself and figure it all out on your own, or even just by reading, to be honest, it doesn't give you that same impact and that same pace of learning.
Mm, yeah, definitely. Well, what are some things that you think like that Google does? I mean, Google's been a big company for a while now. Like, and they're big for like obviously for a reason. What are some things that you think that they do well, and things that are really maybe from an organizational perspective that they really like are succeeding and kind of allow them to continue to like do good work and make great products.
So I think there are two big things that come to mind. One is a focus on technical excellence, and I don't just mean software. I mean across the board. There's an expectation that things that we are bringing in people who are true experts at building large systems and understanding large systems, and that we're not going to meaningfully compromise in terms of the quality of what we're building. Um, and that was something that as an engineer, especially, the strength of that engineering culture and the quality of the talent that was brought in, that I could learn from and along, was incredible. And then related to that, the second point, which is not distinct completely, is actually how loosely run Google was, which sounds strange, right? But what you find with a lot of companies, especially older companies that predated like sort of the technology world, is that they try to manage projects quite tightly, right? So you've got things like, you know, strict roadmaps and a lot of business analysts, and maybe agile frameworks that are mandated, maybe something like SAFe and so on. And that actually really squeezes a lot of autonomy and agility out of the teams, which is ironic. A lot of these frameworks call themselves agile frameworks, but they actually constrain teams very much in terms of how they operate. And, at Google, we didn't even really use Scrum, but in particular, every team just figured out for itself the right way it had to operate. And that was a conversation within the team. And, the team had a high level mandate. They set some OKRs, objectives and key results, that, they had to synchronize with leadership. But again, the team had a lot of autonomy in setting their own OKRs relative to their mission and their mandate. And that gave them the ability to focus on building really significant software and solving big problems. Um, and I think it is worth noting that Google has been, was and remains in a luxurious position of having a lot of cash, which makes life easier. It causes its problems as well. Um, but I think what it did, especially in the early days, is make intelligent use of that cash, um, by reinvesting it in the business. And I think often companies in Australia are very much focused on the bottom line rather than the top line, right? Which is like, making a profit, which is great, but that means that they don't invest as heavily in building great technology as they could. And I think if you, again, view it over a long enough arc, you wouldn't say that, Google spending billions of dollars on search technology, on ad technology, on maps was anything other than a really fantastic use of investors' money. So, yeah, I think a lot of these things, they come from the top. And I think as I've been in my career for longer, I've appreciated that more and more, that the way we got to operate as individual engineering teams at Google were based on how people at the very top of the company were thinking about things that seemed quite distant to me at the time, like capital allocation, and how they think about product and how they think about accountability in the company.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I think that was really interesting. And what are some things, like there was heaps of things there that Google does really well. What are some things, if you were perhaps a young person looking for a job now, like what are some of those things that you would look for in an organization that you kind of want to see and say, whether it's like talented employees, or a good structure, like we just spoke about. Is there anything
Mm.
there that you would kind of really highlight as things that you'd really look for?
I mean, I think talented employees is kind of a gimme. Like, yes, I think good people like working with good people. So that is definitely a big one. But in terms of the actual company structure, and sort of company culture, I would say there are two things to look out for depending on the type of company. Um, so if it's an older company, a company, say you're looking to join an insurance company, or something like that, someone that's been around for a while, that sort of predates tech, for want of a better term, then
Mm.
what you want to look at, they might be undergoing a digital transformation, or whatever they call it internally. What you want to look for is the degree to which the company is genuinely committed to that, because it's a profound change that needs to come from the top. And so you can't really, in my view, kind of incrementally undergo a digital transformation, because it's actually, it's not a technology transformation, right? It's actually a cultural transformation that is embodied in technology, right? You need to start doing everything differently. And so you want to see, is the company really, does it have the appetite and the courage to go through that? So that's on the one side of things. That's if you're working for an older, larger, established company. If you're looking to join, say, a newer company, a scale up, let's say, a company that maybe was founded 7, 8, 9 years ago and now has a few hundred employees, you're nearly looking for the opposite problem, which is, have they done what it takes to mature, right? Um, a lot of companies, and this was actually one of the downsides I feel at Google. We talked about the upsides. Is you have what I call the sort of the Peter Pan syndrome, where they don't want to grow up, right? And they're like, it was really fun when we were a startup, and it was a bunch of people in a room eating pizza and drinking beer, and it was great. And suddenly you're 200 people, and you're still trying to run the company in the same way. And what happens if you're not careful is you get a lot of the worst things about being at a larger organization without the benefits, right? So what you want
Mm.
to do is, and if you hear a bigger company saying, "Oh, we're still like a startup," to me that's a yellow flag. You want to dig in a little bit deeper, because that's sort of like, you know a 40-year-old saying, "I'm still like a teenager." It's like, well, are you not just embarrassing yourselves at that point? And so you want to understand, like, has the company kept that spirit of innovation and agility of a startup, but actually layered in the structures that allows them to effectively execute at scale? Because otherwise, what it becomes is, I think, is technically called a shit show, and it might seem great that there's sort of no guidance and no accountability, but what it means is you end up with a lot of destructive interference where everyone's going off in a different direction, and what that feels
Mm.
like is, one, no career progression, and two, you don't feel like you're making progress, right? There's a lot of activity, but not a lot of progress. And so those are things I think I'd look out for. Is, in a sense, it's sort of coming at it from opposite directions. Is, does that organization have that blend of maturity and agility that allows it to be a place where you can really grow in your career and have an impact on the world?
Mm. Yeah, that's really cool. And there's a useful tips I think for people hunting for a job at the moment. What are some things that, like, because you have your own company at the moment and you kind of trying to put it in some of these best practices like in the
Mm.
early days, are there any things that you really like now as you're building the company, those sort of cornerstone things, are there any of those that you're really trying to focus on, in terms of that, creating that good culture and trying to have that foundation, to build the company in a right way?
Yeah, I do, and I think it is about values and alignment. So having shared values, and this is one of those things. It's easy to be cynical about it. So many companies have a set of company values, and they make a nice poster and they stick it on a wall, and everyone walks past and ignores the poster. But if you have values and what we call at Circular virtues as well, which are concrete behaviors that are aligned to our values, that we say, this is how we behave. This is at this company. And that means, like, one of our virtues is ask why a lot, right? So we're actually encouraging people to question stuff, right? And if we are explicit about that, and then we talk about it, and we lead by example, and we encourage and reward those behaviors, then you're creating a strong culture from the beginning. And one of the things about culture is, it's why is culture why does culture get spoken about so much? It's because it's this force that is highly scalable, uh, and also that when I say it's highly scalable, what I mean is, as an organization grows, its culture travels along with that growth, right? Because culture is imposed, or transferred rather, peer to peer. So if you have a strong culture, it's not a few people in management or leadership trying to get people to do things a certain way. You join a company, you absorb the culture from the people around you. And so if you have a good culture, as you grow, it's one of the most scalable ways of making sure your organization is still functioning well. And then the other thing, which is very much a double edged sword, is that a culture has an immune system, I call it, right? Which is, whatever culture
Mm.
you have is really hard to change. It resists change. So if you have a good culture, it will resist change. If you have a bad culture, it will also resist change. So trying to change a culture that has already deeply established itself in an organization is extremely difficult. It's possible, but only in a very painful and expensive way. And so, setting the culture correctly from the beginning is extremely high leverage. So, that's something that I try to do. And then, alongside that, I mentioned alignment. And again, that's something that I was talking about, about these companies that don't grow up. um, it's really important early on when you can get everyone in a room or in a Zoom call easily, and everyone knows each other well. You can just have stand-ups or syncs, and you stay aligned that way. But when you start hiring a lot of people, and then you might have a few layers of management, it can be very easy, surprisingly easy, not for different parts of the company to have different ideas of what's important to do, or the right way of doing things, or what the priorities are for the organization. And that's when, like I said, you start pulling in different directions. Um, and so, again, perhaps earlier than a lot of other companies at Circular, we've made an effort to build in sort of scaled rituals for sharing alignment and context. Like, even when there were just 10 of us, we had a weekly all hands meeting where we'd go through all the company numbers and go through, what our top priorities were as a company, and taking questions and so on. With 10 people, is it overkill to do that weekly? Maybe. But now we're 20 people, and that's scaled effortlessly. And if we get to 100 people, it will still be we will still be able to share context and alignment that way. So those are the sorts of things that I think about. And, ultimately it is why I ended up co-founding a startup, is because I see that so many of these things, really, these are foundational things that need to be laid down at the beginning. Coming in later, you have much less ability to influence change, and that's true as a leader, but also as an employee. So, I think if you look at my career, I've kind of gone backwards from very big companies like Google through to scale ups like Airtasker, and now to my own startup. And there are a lot of different ways to construct a career. Absolutely. I'm actually and I didn't plan it this way, but I'm quite happy with how that sequencing has worked out, because it does give you that context to see how things are done well at a larger scale. And then you go backwards into an earlier stage, and you kind of know a little bit about what comes next and what those things are that you can bring to an
Mm.
earlier stage company. Whereas if you go straight into a startup, a lot of people I admire do that and can do an incredible job. But in a way, it's harder because you don't have anything to measure things by, right? You're
Mm.
just thrown into the chaos and need to figure it out.
Yeah, no, cool. I think it's really cool how you've done that as well. I think you've had some really that variety of experiences, like you said, and knowing kind of the best or great ways to do things, helps a lot when you're going into a place like a startup. Because if you're just trying to work things out from the ground up, like we've spoken about, when you're in that startup situation, then things can get tricky, I think. I'd love to talk about, yeah, like you mentioned there, your experience at Airtasker. So you started off there as the VP of engineering, going from, I assume, just like perhaps a team lead or a senior engineer. What was kind of the biggest differences there between being an engineer, but to sort of the vice president of that, where you're kind of detached a little bit more from the actual engineering, and you're kind of having to manage people more so than specific technology. Kind of what are the key things there?
Yeah. So when I left Google, I was already managing teams, but the real difference going from Google to Airtasker was going from, um, I guess, being a culture recipient to being a culture maker, right? Which is to say, I talked about Google, obviously a very strong engineering culture and also a massive company, and I was a very small cog in that big, amazing machine. And so, really, as a leader there, it is your job to understand how things are done and apply them to your team specific context, to the people, to the teams, to the mission of those teams, which was really interesting. But I think after a time, I started to get my own ideas, which is always dangerous, right? About
Mm.
how things should be done, and so that became a bit of an itch for me that I needed to scratch. And so, I think when I came to Airtasker, again, it was a scale up company that needed to mature its engineering culture to make its practices and ways of doing things match the stage it was at as a company. And what that meant is it was my job to take some of the things I'd learned at Google and not recreate them at Airtasker because every company is different, every scale is different, but to take what I'd learned at Google and apply those lessons to think about the best way for Airtasker's engineering to mature. And I found that both difficult and rewarding. But if you get the right team around you, that's really exciting. But I actually think you were maybe asking a slightly different question, which is about the transition from being, I guess, hands-on with the tools like as a senior engineer or whatnot, um, to more of a management and leadership position. And that really comes down to um, changing the way you have impact. And one of the models that I've heard of thinking about this that I like is that you change from a model of being additive to one of being multiplicative, right? So if you're an individual contributor, you can say, well, the way I achieve a set level of impact, say 100 impact points, is by doing 100
Mm.
impact points worth of work myself, right? And that can be, you can build a whole career as an individual contributor. And actually, um, now that we're going there, you asked me about what made Google special. Um, it was one of the first companies that built a proper individual contributor career track so that you could get, extremely uh, senior without having to move into management, which was, really important. So you could just keep getting that impact points that you add. You could just keep growing that and not hit a glass ceiling in your career. And so, for example, I think, terms like principal engineer and distinguished engineer, uh, if Google didn't actually come up with them, I think they were one of the first companies to implement that as a core part of its career pathway. Anyway, so that's an aside. But what I was going to say is when you move into management, uh, you suddenly become a multiplier factor, right? You're managing a team of 5 people, let's say, and you don't get to do a whole lot of adding, right? What you do is instead say, okay, if we have 5 people and they're each producing 100 impact points, and I, as a manager, can make the right moves, which means in terms of leading, coaching, aligning, removing obstacles, whatever it is, that I can have a multiplier effect across those 500 impact points, right? So you say I make my whole team 20% more impactful, more productive. So we go from 500 impact points to 600. Well, that's how I get my 100 impact points as a manager.
Mm.
Which makes it sort of clear why, in a lot of cases, management is the greatest in terms of your career pathway, the way to have the greatest impact. Because as you grow in your career there, you can apply your multiplier over a larger and larger number of people, right? So suddenly, if you're responsible for a group of 100 people and you make them all 10% better, then that's a huge amount of leverage, which is why, yeah, senior leaders do tend to be sought after and well rewarded. But it is quite a mindset shift, right? It's harder to feel productive when what you are doing is one level removed, when you are working to make other people more productive and kind of, getting a share of the credit for that, rather than being productive yourself.
Mm. Yeah, that's a fantastic analogy. I think. Thanks for sharing that with us. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting to see now the sort of individual contributor path, like you mentioned, kind of start to get into places and start to become a real viable path. Because certainly, I think there's a lot of value in specializing and being someone that's really a proper expert in what you do. I want to ask more about someone that's like a junior engineer or someone that's a junior, someone that's just starting working, and perhaps in the engineering context, you spoke about those 100 impact points, and I wonder, like, as a junior, kind of what things would you recommend to someone that kind of wants to do like have as many impact points as they can. Like, is there any ways you think about that, and perhaps things that
Mm.
principles that they should follow to kind of to do that?
The biggest one that I can think of is to really try to understand the business and the product that you are working on. And again, coming in as an engineer, I think it can be, and I fell into this trap completely. It can be very easy to see your job as being to write code and ship features, um, but it's not, right? Your job is, I use the term impact points deliberately because I really don't care how much work you do. It's how much impact you have that
Mm,
matters, right? And so if you want to have those impact points, you need to understand what's important to your customers or users or stakeholders, and ultimately to the company, and then ultimately to the business. If you're working at a business, which I guess most people are. If you're working in government or a non-profit, understand what the ultimate goals of that organization are, uh, and become a student of that, because no matter what role you're in, um, you will be able to make better decisions. You'll be able to prioritize your time better. You will be able to ask more intelligent questions if you're able to see the big picture and understand why your employer is asking you to do the things that you're doing rather than simply doing what you're told. So,
mm,
and I feel like, again, engineering, because it's a technical role and there's so much to learn about, building software, that there's often this big missed opportunity to say that, as a manager, I can tell you the most valuable engineers are, in a vast majority of cases, the ones who have these so-called soft skills around communication, product understanding, commercial understanding, and are able to combine that with strong technical skills to have the
mm.
maximum impact on the product.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and understanding why is something that it's not super hard to do, but I guess you can. It has a large impact on what you're doing, and just giving yourself that context of where does your role fit in within the organization and things like that too.
Yeah,
I think is yeah.
and this may not be possible in every organization, depending. Hopefully, if you've got a good manager, it is possible. Like I nearly set a principle for myself, and talking about the values and virtues that I'm putting in circular. I'm trying to create this for everyone. Is you shouldn't start doing a piece of work until you understand why that piece of work is worth doing, right? Which is to say, the model of you are just a pair of hands and you are renting out your time. I think that's outdated in most organizations, right? You are. It's not like you're trading your time for money. You're trading your ability to deliver value for money, right? And so, in a sense, you need to take responsibility for making sure that your time is being used effectively and that you're not wasting it. Um, and I think understanding the motivations of your manager or your leadership as to why you're being asked to do a certain piece of work often gives you an opportunity to be more effective. But at the same time, it doubles as a great way of learning, right? You start to see how you're fitting into a bigger picture. And so it's just a good principle. Understand the why of what you're doing before you actually start doing it, and be as insistent as is politically viable at your organization to have that
Mm,
understanding.
yeah, I think that's really cool. Um, who are some people that I'm curious? Like, yeah, who are some people that inspire you, and or who are some people that um, you know that you look to and think that they're setting a really good example for yourself, perhaps people that you aspire to be more like. Is there anyone like that for yourself?
I mean, from a sort of company leadership point of view, I really like Reed Hastings from Netflix. He wrote a book last year, I think, called No Rules Rules. His head of people wrote a similar book called Powerful a couple of years before that. And both of those are based, in a sense, on Netflix's famous culture deck, which, is something that they've been kind of building on for years. And, I think Netflix is the best embodiment of this model of really, they call it leading with context and not control. So hiring great people, being somewhat ruthless in terms of your expectations of them, right? This is a pro sports team, not a family. Again, that's something that I really believe in the workplace. Families are great, but it's just a different kettle of fish, right? Families don't have a mission, they just are. And so it's
Mm,
not the right model. And then the third thing is leading with context and not control, which means it really comes down to what I've just been saying. You don't tell people what to do so much as you tell people what needs to be achieved, and you expect them to figure out the best way to achieve those things because you've given them enough of that business and product context that they know everything you do as a senior leader and they can apply it to the specific problem that they and their team have been charged with solving. And so it's a very kind of interesting combination of they call it freedom and responsibility. So they've got nice slogans for all of these things, right? Which is you give people a huge amount of freedom and the context to exercise that freedom wisely, but you're also giving them a very heavy responsibility to deliver massive value with that freedom and that context that you've given them. And I think if executed well, that is really the type of company that and the organization that I'd like to work for and be a part of building.
mm. Oh, cool. Well, I hope that circular can can grow and have those kinds of values and really support people and create that environment so that people can have that freedom to have great impact as well. I've got one last question for you, Yaniv, and that's a question I ask all the guests on the show. And it's the question is this: if you had to rewind the clock back to when you were first starting work, knowing what you know now, is there anything, any advice you'd give yourself, or anything that you'd do differently in that situation?
Yeah, I think I'd back myself more and be more entrepreneurial. And I suspect there's a generational element to this, where you go from a couple of generations back where it was kind of a lifetime employment sort of thing, uh, maybe to my generation where there's a lot more mobility in people's careers, but it still tended to follow a path of full time jobs, from one to another. To I think now when I'm seeing a lot of the sorts of communities like the one that you're serving, right, where people are really trying to be the architects of their own careers. So when I say entrepreneurialism, sure, some of the time that means starting your own business, or it might mean starting a side hustle or a podcast or anything like that, um, and building a personal brand. But it also means taking a more active control of your career and not being as passive and say, well, I've got my job now. I need to work towards my next promotion or whatnot. It's really a question of being, the architect of your own career and understanding, of course, that the future is very difficult to predict, but to have a set of goals and principles that you proactively set and then try to design your career around that. I think I'm seeing a lot more of that with the current generation of graduates and early career folks, and I'm really kind of in awe of that and a bit envious of that. And I sort of think if I'd been more intentional in designing my career, where could I have gotten to, or could I have gotten to where I have earlier? So that's something that I feel that's the advice I would have to myself is, be intentional in planning a career. The tools that are available these days are incredible, right? Just from things like this podcast to communities like Early Work, through to just the vast amount of resources online, the ability to start side hustles fairly easily, the availability of capital for early stage startups. That there is a lot of stuff around now that didn't used to exist, and I think if I were around now, I would hope that I'd be able to make more use of that stuff and really, yeah, be intentional and mindful in designing my career.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and certainly there's so many resources available today for people, and it's great to hear your thoughts there about being more intentional because I think that's something that, yeah, like you said, with the things that are available, it's something that we can all strive to do more. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Yaniv. I have I guess to finish off the show, where should people go to find out more about yourself and more about what you do?
Yep. So I'm active on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. I'm also increasingly active on Twitter, so my handle there is at @ybernstein. Slightly different. I post different sort of stuff, a bit more, suitable for the relevant platform. Uh, I also have a newsletter called People Engineering. So that's newsletter.peopleeng.com, where I share my thoughts on how to build a scalable, high performing organization, which is part of what we talked about now. More recently, I also have a podcast called the Startup Podcast, available in all your favorite podcast apps, which is a collaboration with Chris Sard, who's a well-known operator here in Australia, and there we talk about it's nearly like a mini MBA, talking about what you need to know about as someone working at a startup or as a founder at a startup. And finally, but by no means least, is my own startup, Circular. Um, we are live in Singapore and Australia. We're hiring actively in Australia for a variety of roles. So check us out on nowcircular.com/careers. Have a look at what's going on. And we're going to go into general availability in Australia shortly. So if you feel like checking out the product, please do.
Yes, cool. Well, I've actually had a look at Circular. Yeah, I think it's super cool what you guys are building, and I'll be hopefully on there when I need my next new device.
You can do that.
Thank, yeah. Thanks so much for your time today, Yaniv, and yeah, have a great week.
Yeah, thank you, James. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you want to get my takeaways, the things that I learnt from this episode, please go to graduatetheory.com/subscribe, where you can get my takeaways and all the information about each episode straight to your inbox. Thanks so much for listening again today, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.